Thank you everyone for joining tonight's program. Please allow me just a brief introduction. My name is Patty Smolin. I am serving as a tech assistant for tonight's program. So I'm just going to take a couple of moments to review a few features. If you could please be so kind as to stay muted during the presentations, just because there may be some background noise you're not aware of. And sorry, I'm still attending to the waiting room. We still have some people coming in, forgive me. And so if you could stay muted at present. You can also use the chat feature to send messages or questions throughout tonight's program, and our speakers may either pause periodically to address those questions, or certainly they will scoop them up at the end. Also, I hope that you are all able to see we have provided closed captioning for tonight's session, and so you should be able to see that at the bottom of your screen. If for any reason you're not, you might need to, it is enabled on our side, you might need to adjust the settings on your own. I'm going to stop here. Turn it over to Kim Inman and also the Delta Sigma leadership for introductions for tonight's program.
Thank you, Patty. Hi, well, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area, I'd like to welcome you to Voting Rights, Bringing History Up to Date, a program that's going to address the heart of who we are as an organization. And we are thrilled to be partnering with the Deltas tonight. Just a tiny bit of our own history. After the suffragists won women's right to vote in 1920, they founded the League of Women Voters in Chicago at the Congress Hotel.
So I went to elementary school for the first couple of years.
The League's mission has been to help citizens become informed and active voters.
And so
we're proud to be nonpartisan. We're neither supporting or opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government, but we're always working on issues of concern to our members and the public. And of course, tonight's topic is of vital interest to us, and I hope to you as well. Chantel?
Thank you so much. My name is Chantel Porter, and I am the president of the Schaumburg Hoffman Estates Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated is an organization of college-educated women committed to the constructive development of its members and to public service with a primary focus on the Black community. The major programs of the sorority are based upon the organization's 5-point programmatic thrust: economic development, educational development, international awareness and involvement, physical and mental health, and political awareness and involvement. And that last thrust is what excites me about partnering with the Palatine League of Women Voters for this very important event. The Schaumburg Hoffman Estates Alumni Chapter has been serving the Northwest suburbs since 1991, and our members are intricately involved in all areas of the community, including voter education community, and we are very excited to partner with the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area and this really important presentation on voting rights. Thank you.
Here in everybody. So we'll get started to voting and improve civic participation, especially in communities of color and low income. And these events includes leading statewide action for the 2016 and 2020 elections. AMI, restorative academic and civic engagement, which focuses on current and formerly incarcerated students of psychological and brain sciences, the South Asian Bar Association. She also and her BA in psychological and cognitive. Clifford Helm as a program counsel and works primarily in Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Equitable Development Initiative. He has worked with community organizations, coalitions, nonprofits, and cooperatives across Chicago on drafting community benefit agreements and developing strategies and policies to support equitable development. Previously, Clifford ran his own law practice with the support of Justice Entrepreneurs Project, providing legal services to businesses, social enterprises, nonprofits, and cooperatives in Chicago. He serves on the board of State Matters, a civics education organization. Clifford has received his law degree from the University of Michigan. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, Ami and Chris, we're going to now proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Cliff, for starting off the PowerPoint. And my name is Ami Gandhi. I'm Senior Counsel with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And I have the privilege of leading our organization's voting rights work for Illinois and Indiana. I know we're all glad to come together, even though inevitably there are tech issues that come up for a community gathering like this. If you have trouble seeing me or hearing me at any point, just give me a shout. You can find a way to let me know through the chat or otherwise, or to let Cliff know. But we wanted to, first of all, thank you as the co-host organizations. Thank you so much for inviting us to join you all this evening in this discussion about voting rights. Here's a brief outline of what we plan to cover this evening, and we have reserved plenty of time for questions. And so please think about the questions that these conversations and these topics trigger in your mind. Feel free to ask the questions in the chat or save them until the end when we'll have more of a Q&A and discussions. And we can go on to the next slide. Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, despite our name, which might be a little bit misleading, we do voter work not only in the city of Chicago, but we do voting rights work across Illinois and also in Indiana. And we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to advance racial equity and economic opportunity. Our organization has its origins in the 1960s in the civil rights era. And that time period had enormous consequences for Chicago and Illinois, for all of our communities. And we'll be touching on some of those historical events today. We have three core practice areas in our organization, including not just voting rights, but also education equity and equitable community development and housing. And you'll get a little bit of a flavor of our work in today's presentation, particularly our voting rights work. But we hope to stay connected with you all for any kind of civil rights issue or racial justice issue that may come up that you'd like to discuss with us. Cliff and I really look forward to staying in touch with you all. We try to use a community lawyering approach in our civil rights work to give the priority and voice to communities most directly impacted by the disenfranchisement and disparities that we talk about in our legal work. And going on to the next slide, some of you may have heard about us through our election protection hotline. Again, everything we do is nonpartisan, including our election protection hotline. And we answer the calls to 866 our vote that come from Illinois and Indiana voters, particularly on election day. And some of you may have called this line before. Well, I know a lot of you know a whole lot about voting, so maybe you already knew all of the sufficient information about how to exercise your voting rights, but you may have heard of other people calling this hotline if they needed assistance, especially during election time. And we're really proud to work with this network across the country, where this number works in any part of the country for people who are looking for nonpartisan assistance about any kind of voter access question, big or small. We don't tell people which candidate or party to vote for, we don't opine on that. But whether it's a small question about registration or a more complicated question about voter intimidation, we're happy to help people out. And one of the features of our election protection program is that we are really glad to be available during any election, not just a presidential election, but local elections as well. And there are companion lines available for community members who feel comfortable in languages other than English. And I'm happy to say that this line works all year round, not just during election day. During most of the year, as you can imagine, the number would go to voicemail when people call in, because it may not be as urgent of an issue if the community member is calling during a time of year when there's not an election happening. And then during an election time, the calls would be answered live. And some of the issues that we resolve in our hotline include voter intimidation, as I mentioned, questions about when and where and how to register to vote, questions about polling place location, and access questions such as questions about language access and disability access to the polls. We wanted to give you a sense of what we do with all of that rich information that we gather during election time. As much as possible, we try to work with community members, election officials, and advocates to resolve the issue or question someone was facing right away on the spot before the polls closed, so that ideally someone can resolve their issue and have access to the polls before it's too late. And if we have to escalate something to a higher up decision maker, like an election official or the headquarters of an election authority's office, we are equipped to do that. We really try to take a collaborative approach, which I think is more possible in Illinois and Cook County than a lot of other geographic areas. And we really enjoy a rich history of collaborating with local election authorities, not trying to shame them when there's something that went wrong in terms of a voter access issue, but rather trying to work with them and work with the voter to open up the lines of communication so that someone can get their concern addressed right away. If there is something we have to escalate, we will do that as a backup plan. We have the tools to do that if needed. And we, going to the next slide or animation, what we do with the data and stories is decide when something needs to be escalated to the point of litigation, which we see as a last resort if there has not been any other more collaborative way to work out an issue with the government authority. We also try to work with lawmakers and community members to improve the election system going forward. If there are systemic issues that we see, we'll talk about voter registration barriers today, for example. If the question comes up time and time again from a bunch of calls that we're getting in, particularly from community members of color, we know that just the election protection hotline is not going to solve everything for everyone. And we really need to look at a more systemic approach to changing our laws that govern our election system. So that's the instance that we would work on legislative reform or administrative reform. And we provide know your rights presentations and community education, especially when it gets closer to the election time. So please count on us for that as well. And we hope that we can continue to collaborate with you all when it comes time for more specific implementable know your rights type information. Moving on to the next slide, or this one is good, thank you. We learned that there may be an interest by the audience members tonight in backing up and talking about the history of racial disparities in voting. That's a really important aspect of the kind of work that we do at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And so we wanted to provide some of the key dates in the history of voting in the United States that affect our vantage point and our approach, really that remind us that our voting system was far from perfect to begin with. And when we talk about necessary improvements to our election system in Illinois and beyond, we think that it's very important to grapple with the history of the voting system and the fact that it was set up specifically to exclude community members of color, particularly Black voters and women and other marginalized communities. And so here on this slide, you'll see a number of key events in the history of voting that especially bring to light the unfair barriers to access faced by women and people of color in our country's history. And even though some of these events occurred a long time ago, some of them were really not very long ago at all. And the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, really was a hard-fought victory accomplished by Black community members and others active in the civil rights movement, and provided a whole new opportunity for voter access by Black voters, especially because it provided some uniformity through that federal legislation that was sorely lacking before that. And when we look at even something a few years later in 1975 with the amendments to the Voting Rights Act, at that time, there were additional groups brought in and specifically targeted by the law in an effort to make our voting system even more inclusive and equitable. And it was 1975 when some important amendments around language access were instituted that required election officials to provide oral and written assistance at the polls for citizens who were still in the process of learning English when the population size rose to a threshold that was high enough when these legal requirements kicked in and required this type of assistance for citizens. We'll go on to the next slide and talk about some of the few more recent events that highlight the racial disparities in voting. One item I want to mention that some of you may be familiar with is the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also called the Motor Voter Law. And that required state motor vehicle agencies to offer voter registration opportunities and applications in the process of when people were obtaining driver's licenses or interacting with their state and local governments in other specific ways. And this law also required states to maintain current and accurate voter registration lists and opportunities to register to vote more broadly. And we'll talk a little bit later about persistent issues that exist when it comes to access to registration to voting. You know, that first step when people can enter the voting system and be having a pathway forward to get involved when election day comes. We also see some highlights on here that impact community members with disabilities in particular. And we know that community members with disabilities and communities of color are not two mutually exclusive groups. And it's really important to keep in the conversation people of color with disabilities whose access to voting is essential as a part of any racial justice movement. There are a few recent cases also listed on here, including the Shelby County versus Holder case of 2013 and the Brnovich case that came down this year itself by the United States Supreme Court. And these legal developments at the United States Supreme Court level have really signified the erosion of voting rights for a lot of Americans and has shared the message loud and clear that different people from different communities, unfortunately, even in 2021, have different levels of access to voting. And one of the concerning aspects of these recent decisions is that they kind of wave off or trivialize the barriers that some people face to voting. And in the Brnovich decision, for example, that we've heard a lot of folks in the media and other civic leaders talk about this year, one of the parts of that court decision that really concerned me, it was about Arizona specific laws. So it was not directly relevant to Illinois voters, but when the Supreme Court justices concluded that something that could be chalked up as a mere inconvenience to particular racial groups of voters, then the court determined that that was not necessarily a legal violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And for those of us who are involved in helping people vote, I know a lot of you help people register to vote and then we conduct election protection, answer people's questions during the election. I think we all well know that something that might be kind of written off or laughed off as a mere inconvenience for a lot of our community members, especially people who are new to voting, a mere inconvenience can make the whole difference between whether someone is able to access voting, whether they're willing to go through with it despite facing barriers, or whether they just give up, even for very understandable reasons, like I can't wait in line anymore, or some other legitimate reason why they weren't able to follow through with voting, even despite being eligible. And so those are some of the concerning patterns that we've seen that perpetuate the racial disparities of voting. And going on to the next slide, I just want to reiterate again that one of the reasons that we focus on race explicitly in our civil rights work and in our racial justice work and our voting rights work is because the countries and the state's elections were specifically set up for only select groups of people to vote, and namely white men. And many people are surprised to learn that there were those kinds of barriers to voting in Illinois in addition. And we have a lot of history in Illinois of machine politics, fixing elections, communities of color being used in different elections and being bought at times. And some of that is old news, very long ago, outdated history, but some of the effects still persist, unfortunately. For example, in Illinois, voter registration rates for voters of color lag behind the rates for white voters. Let me say that a little bit more clearly. In Illinois, the registration rates for eligible white voters still is significantly more than the voter registration rates for the counterparts in the Black, Asian, and Latino communities, even when we're just looking at eligible voters. If we're just comparing citizens of this race to citizens of this race, we still see persistent racial disparities. And that's unacceptable in this day and age that we still see that. And that's part of the reason that our organization and other voting rights advocates have focused so intensely on innovations like automatic voter registration, which I'll touch on briefly as well. And we still see that voters, going to a little bit of a different topic than voter registration, we still see that voters in entirely Black census block groups, or in other words, entirely Black neighborhoods or areas, on average must wait longer in lines at the polls as compared to voters living in neighborhoods or census block groups with no Black residents. And we've seen in our voting rights work in Illinois that voters of color often face subtle and multi-layered barriers, where an unexpected change in a polling location or a language issue can mean the difference between an eligible voter casting their ballot or staying silent and not having the chance to hear their voice heard. So we'll go on to the next slide, and you can go back one to the slide about automatic voter registration. Thank you. Our organization and other advocates, probably many of you here, advocated fiercely for the passage of automatic voter registration in the recent years in Illinois. And this is a law that was passed and signed in 2017 on a bipartisan unanimous basis. It was signed into law by former Governor Rauner, to the surprise of a lot of people nationwide who looked to Illinois with respect and appreciation for setting the tone that voter access reform could be a bipartisan initiative. And the whole concept of automatic voter registration was and is that if the state has identifying information about us anyway, through processes we have to go through, like getting a driver's license, getting a real ID, signing up for certain kinds of social service benefits, and so on, then the idea of automatic voter registration is that if there's sufficient identifying information and signatures that the state has about us already, then it should be as streamlined as possible for us to get registered to vote through that same process without requiring extra paperwork or extra signatures or extra steps. And the opt-out aspect of automatic voter registration is also very important. So that idea is that people should have the right to not register to vote if for any reason they choose that they don't want to register to vote. And automatic voter registration has been shown to help expand voter access to eligible voters, to citizens who are age eligible, in other words, and can help close some of those racial gaps that I talked about a moment ago that have been caused historically by unjust voter registration barriers. The nonpartisan coalition Just Democracy Illinois was really concerned that even for literally years after this law was signed in 2017, the implementation of the law was delayed and then was flawed in a variety of ways. And the Just Democracy Illinois coalition was represented in these advocacy efforts to try to insist that the state of Illinois better implement automatic voter registration. Just Democracy Illinois was represented by us, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, as well as our co-counsel at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and also the law firm of Skadden. And after a long period of time of those negotiations and attempted collaborations that didn't feel like they were fruitful and didn't feel like they were doing justice to the voters of Illinois who deserved better, we, as a last resort, filed suit against the Illinois Secretary of State's office and the Illinois State Board of Elections last year in early 2020, seeking enforcement of automatic voter registration in Illinois and alleging violations of federal civil rights laws. The case had a bunch of delays, delay after delay with COVID times, as you can imagine. And we ultimately were able to reopen the conversations and collaborations with the Illinois Secretary of State's office and reached a settlement in June of this year, June of 2021, after about a year and a half of litigation. And we're really proud and grateful that we reached the point where nonpartisan voting rights advocates could come to an agreement and a compromise with the state of Illinois about how automatic voter registration should be improved from here on out. The settlement agreement is public. If anyone's ever interested in looking at it, we can share it with you. As far as the specific changes that were made to the implementation as a result of this advocacy. And we have seen some notable improvements in the process since the settlement, such as improved language access measures for citizens who are still in the process of learning English, additional safeguards for ineligible people to not be presented with voter registration options. And one aspect of the system that I think is helpful and that advocates had insisted upon is for people when they're going through the driver's license process or getting or renewing an ID, that they be informed of what is their current voter registration status and address, so that they can be conscious of it, so that they can make the choice of whether to get on the voter rolls or update their voter records. We'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. And so, you know, as you'll hear Cliff and I talk about, the racial disparities in voter access are persistent. And the 2020 election was certainly a moment in time when that was unfortunately very clear. And the recent decisions by the United States Supreme Court have hollowed out many parts of the Voting Rights Act. And there was also documented disenfranchisement of voters of color during the 2020 election. And that was a wake-up call for many Americans who began to see the effects of racism in our voting system and in other American systems. this year, there have been, last year and this year, there have been a number of anti-voter laws that have been enacted across various states and even places like Illinois that have a recent history of voter access laws as opposed to voter suppression laws. We still see a lot of attempts to suppress voters through restrictive legislation, for example, even in Illinois. And I say this as a nonpartisan advocate, but it is concerning anytime that lawmakers from any party are trying to institute measures to make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. There's no doubt that the right to vote freely, without discrimination and without fear is under threat throughout the country, and that there seems to be a lot of fear around the idea of more people of color and more marginalized community members having more of a say and having more power. And we think that's why it's so important to fight for improvement of voting rights and protect our democracy. We're going to go deeper into a couple specific issues impacting voters here in Illinois, including redistricting and voting rights for community members in the criminal legal system as we continue through this program. And so I'm going to start us off in talking about that a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Cliff. We wanted to start off by saying that Illinois has been a really interesting laboratory for reforms in this arena. And first, I want to start off by explaining some distinctions between different aspects of our criminal legal system. We bring this up in particular because of the disproportionate incarceration in prisons and jails of Black people and people of color. And that's why from when I started at Chicago Lawyers Committee, I joined the staff in 2016, we have had an emphasis on, okay, if we're going to be talking about voting rights, if we're going to be talking about racial equity, we have to talk about the access to democracy by people in our criminal legal system. And one of the distinctions that's important to remember as we delve into who's eligible to vote, who should have the opportunity to vote, is keeping in mind the distinction between jail and prison. And when we're talking about jail, we're talking about a population, whether it's the Cook County Jail, for example, that is physically located in Chicago near 26th in California, but incarcerates community members from all over Cook County, including suburban Cook County, or other jails at the county level. We're talking about a population that's almost completely people in pre-trial detention, people who are being held pre-trial as they are awaiting a judgment in their case. So they've been accused of a crime, but not convicted of a crime, and are primarily being held in jail because of financial inability to pay bail. So it's definitely a system that has a disproportionate impact on low-income community members and on Black and Brown community members. And for people in jail, according to the laws of Illinois and the laws across the country, people in jail do not lose their right to vote if they are in pretrial detention, awaiting more information and legal developments about whether they're facing a conviction or not. And so one of the initiatives that our organization and many others, including the phenomenal organization Chicago Votes and League of Women Voters of Chicago and other allies, have been involved in expanding voter access for already eligible community members who are in pretrial detention, or in other words, in jail. One of the landmark laws that helped to reiterate and strengthen that access, has been called Illinois Senate Bill 2090. And that's what it was called back when it was a bill in the legislative session, but it has been passed into law and signed into law in 2019. And it requires Cook County Jail to be a polling place on election day where people can vote in person if they're eligible to vote in the city of Chicago or suburban Cook County. And this is one of the most impressive operations for a polling place that I have seen. It didn't happen like that overnight. Certainly took some improvement that was needed over time, as has been pointed out by advocates and community members who are incarcerated. But the progress has been notable as far as improved operations and access to same-day registration and a number of other improvements that are being made to the voting conditions in jail. And as we may touch on a little bit later, or we can certainly answer questions about it another time as well, there are also vote by mail programs available for other jails and other parts of Illinois. And that can be an important way for people to access a ballot as well, although it doesn't lead to as robust of turnout rates and participation rates if someone only has the option to vote by mail and doesn't have a choice between voting by mail or voting in person. Having a choice is always going to be better for people's voter participation options and for turnout. And then briefly, I wanted to also talk about some of the civics and other initiatives that impact our community members in prison. So as opposed to jail, when we were talking about people in pretrial detention, in prisons, we're talking about primarily a population of people who have been convicted and who are under a sentence and in a state or federal prison or correctional center. And there are two laws that we had the privilege to work on writing and passing with incarcerated and returning community members that are more relevant to the prison population. One of those was the Civics in Prison Law. And when it was in the legislature, it was called House Bill 2541. And it was inspired by and in large part written by incarcerated community members, people in prison who felt strongly that there needed to be a requirement for in-person peer-led civics education when it was getting close to the time that someone would be ending their sentence, ending their period of disenfranchisement, which I think you'll hear a little bit more about from Cliff later. And when they were going to be soon eligible to reclaim their voting rights, because under the law as it stands in Illinois right now, people are disenfranchised for a period of time upon conviction. And the Civics in Prison Law passed on a largely bipartisan basis and really was due to the hard-fought efforts of incarcerated and returning community members. The implementation of that law is underway. It was slowed by the COVID pandemic, but there still have been some opportunities for people leaving a conviction setting, leaving an incarceration and prison setting to obtain education about their voting rights as they're in the process of being released or discharged. And then last but not least, I wanted to mention a law that passed this year, SB 2116, that relates to the voting rights and civics education of incarcerated youth. And so I'm specifically talking about young people who are incarcerated in Illinois youth centers, and they have some special legal categories that apply to them when we're talking about younger people as opposed to adults. And many of them don't lose the right to vote, but don't necessarily know that they have the right to vote and don't necessarily know how to go through the steps to exercise that right. And so this law passed this year, SB 2116, that's in the very early stages of implementation by Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. That should help address the problem of disenfranchisement and lack of knowledge about voting rights on the part of incarcerated youth. And as I turn it over to Cliff, I wanted to mention that when I do have the opportunity to collaborate with community members in jails and prisons, it's definitely the highlight of the work that I get to do. And those experiences always surprise me and humble me as far as how learned many of our community members are about how important our system of democracy is and what are some great ideas they have about how to improve our democracy. So I always get to learn from them when I'm in those settings, and looking forward to the pandemic conditions improving so that we can get back to that kind of work in the days ahead. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Cliff, who's also in our voting rights practice area and has a lot of other rich community and legal experience as well.
Thank you, Ami. I'm going to interrupt for a second to stop this share. To pick up right where Ami was going, one of the really big advocacy efforts that's going on right now, and with community partners of ours, and one of the groups which Ami actually mentioned already, Chicago Votes, is pushing for a change to the laws around people in prison and their ability to vote. As some background on this, the Illinois Constitution actually mandates that when somebody is convicted of a sentence and goes into confinement or incarceration of some sort, they lose their right to vote. And this has a lot of sort of other effects beyond simply disenfranchising a person going into prison. But it's not really that clear in the Constitution when that right should be returned. And in particular, specifically, it leaves it up to the General Assembly, our legislative body, to clarify that. So there's a big effort right now, the sponsors being LaShawn Ford and Mike Simmons, to actually look at this and to re-enfranchise people 14 days after they would lose that right. So there's some information from Chicago Votes. This is sort of some of their fact sheet types of things and how they're putting things forward. A lot of this campaign is really focused on looking at the directly impacted individuals and what this means to them, and in particular what it means to people in prison and their ability to engage with sort of one of the most meaningful ways to work within society, which is voting, and what it means when we strip that away. I'm gonna go to actually ask, I think somebody else in the room has the link to this video that I would request.
Yes, Cliff, this is Patty and I have it. And if this is where you'd like for me to bring it up, I'd be happy to do that.
Yes, please. So we're gonna listen to one of the individuals, Avalon, at a press conference that was in Springfield around when they were trying to pass this bill, the most recent time, actually.
Okay.
Indeed an honor to be out here today. Thank you, Senator Simmons and Representative Ford. We really appreciate your leadership in the House and in the Senate for this legislation. So my name is Avalon Betts-Gaston. I am the project manager for the Illinois Alliance for Reentry and Justice. We are a statewide coalition made up of directly impacted individuals, service providers, stakeholders, and allies throughout the entire state. We're here because we believe that we must redefine reentry and we must remake justice. Part of remaking justice means that we have to give a voice to the individuals whose voice has been stolen from them through the criminal legal system. These are mothers, these are fathers, these are grandmothers, these are grandfathers that represent people throughout the entire state. They no longer have a say on whether or not their loved ones can have access to clean water and clean air, access to parks, recreational activities, what schools will remain open in their neighborhoods, where will their grandchildren learn how to write their names and say their alphabets. These are human beings who have been locked away as a result of the criminal legal system, who have just been silenced. Their voice has been ripped from them. Their humanity has been taken from them. And that should not be the case, because there is no conviction upon which your person's humanity should be stripped from them. None. I don't care how heinous it might be, they are still a human being. They still wake up, they put their pants leg on, one leg at a time. They wake up still yearning to touch their loved ones, yearning to hear from their loved ones, yearning to be a part of their loved ones' lives. And they have no voice. They have no voice in their lives because The system has said you are less than. And we're here to say, nope, these are our brothers, these are our sisters, these are the people that we love, these are the people who we cherish, these are the people who we respect. These are gems in our communities. They come home and do amazing things in our communities. And they deserve the right to determine what conditions they have to serve their time under. They deserve the right to say, my kids' schools should remain open. They deserve the right to say, my children should have access to lunch and good education and mental health care. And again, the basics, safe and secure housing, clean water, clean air. They deserve the right to speak on behalf of our children. There are approximately 100,000 children in this state who have no one to speak for them at the ballot box. I'm going to say that again. We have approximately 100,000 children in this state that have no one to speak at the ballot box for them. And we should be ashamed of that statistic, because they deserve to have someone speak for them. And so I stand here in proud unison with Chicago Votes and all of the other coalition members, and we say, not another day. We need to get this done now, and we need to restore the right to vote to our brothers and sisters inside so they can advocate for their children and their grandchildren and their neighbors, because that's what we do in the state of Illinois, is we look out for each other. And the way we do that is not only in person one-on-one, but we do it through the ballot box. And so we need this bill passed in the veto session, because we don't need to go not another day. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Avalon, we are going to
Thank you. We can stop it there. All right. Actually, so I've gone too far. So that was to me and to us, that was like a pretty amazing view of some of the advocacy that's happening, and not just because of what the bill is trying to do, but because of the community that's there with them. So you can see Ami there. There's another one of our staff members there, a number of people from Chicago Votes there, and then the two people on the far and this right were the senator and the representative who were sponsoring this bill. So a really, really amazing connection of people. Also, real quick, speaking of amazing people working on this, I believe we have another person here, Dr. Christina Rivers. Welcome. Always appreciate your contributions, and she's been also a big help, particularly in voting in jail and civics in prison with us, and a great partner. So with the voting in prison work, I think this is it's a hugely important issue. If you look at just the general demographics and sort of the disparities in what's happened with this mass incarceration and who is in prisons, along with the other issues that have been coming up, from prison-based gerrymandering to some of the other things that we are working on, actively understanding how does this change and affect sort of our society from a voting perspective. As just a real quick thing to note with this is that there's long been, and this has historically been the case in almost every state, there's been a bar on people voting in prison, and there hasn't really been a meaningful policy justification for that bar that's translated into something that is appropriate and understandable today. And we know the reason for that, and its roots are based in discrimination and racism. So we're fully aware of that. I'll move on to another thing that we're working on. So another big thing that's coming up in the news that everybody might be pretty aware of in general is redistricting. It's moving into congressional redistricting. We've actually sort of done some of that already, but it happens once every 10 years after the end of the census. So when we get the new census information from where people live, all the maps that dictate where people's political boundaries and what districts at all levels of government are, they all need to be redrawn to capture the appropriate number of people within each district in terms of where they get to vote and who they vote for. This obviously has some pretty significant consequences. The ones that we'll see in the news sort of over the next couple of weeks and maybe even starting right now are the consequences on the political parties, which grabs a lot of headlines and a lot of attention because we understand that these lines are going to be extremely meaningful for a federal election like the congressional elections, but they're also extremely meaningful for local representation, and in particular around communities and how those individual communities and people in those communities and communities of color and communities that maybe have faced discrimination or disinvestment or a variety of other things that have made their access to the political sphere more difficult. Those lines affect how strong their voice is, and those in turn affects the way that they get represented in local government, county government, state government, and federal government. So a few months ago, I think, time is a little bit hard to tell right now, but weeks or months ago, the state passed new lines related to its state level representative body, the General Assembly, so the House and Senate at the state level. In doing this, they did so in a way that was not extremely transparent in the process that they were going through. So I know a lot of people tried to show up and be part of these hearings. There was not a lot of, let's say, back and forth with the people that were drawing some of those lines. As a result, what came out of the maps really didn't please anybody, except maybe the people drawing the maps. And in some cases, there were real specific and clear instances where communities were, communities of color rather, were drawn in a way that weakened their ability to access government and to vote and as a community and elect their candidates of choice. So in this, we are actually representing a few plaintiff organizations around the boundaries of the map that was drawn in East St. Louis. And these organizations are the East St. Louis branch of the NAACP, Illinois State Conference of the NAACP, and an organization called UCRO, UCRO. I'll get back to them in a second. But we can look at this is what we're bringing up in our perspective around East St. Louis. And so there's two maps overlaid here. The orange reddish one is what the state drew. And that one, this will be hard to tell. It's overlaid with the blue one, which is what our lawsuit is is proposing as a solution to the problem that their map caused. East St. Louis is, as you might know, is a Black community next to St. Louis on the Mississippi River. And it's surrounded by a fairly rural, predominantly white area. This map that they drew puts this Black community in a weird position where parts of that community are split off from there, but then it's grouped together with a very white and very different political leaning or group in the rural areas around East St. Louis. And from our perspective and from the client's perspective, or plaintiff's perspective, they really feel that this damages their ability long-term to elect their candidate of choice. Should be noted as well that this is the only district in the region that, as in the House, has a Black representative. So every other representative anywhere near this region in the House districts is white. So we're in court right now, is going, and we are seeing some of the processes that play out there. Litigation is definitely one tactic in terms of redistricting. The organization I mentioned earlier, though, takes a different tactic. So UCRO is a coalition of organizations. So it's the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations. And they've worked with a diverse set of community partners, both members, individual members, and organizations, to try to create a meaningful unity map, which would bring together a number of concerns across different communities of color to make sure that all those communities are able to have representation in a way that doesn't damage another one, and also meaningfully still provides access to political access based on voting and their ability to elect their candidates. So this is just a screenshot of one of their proposed maps that they came up with at the end. It does not have every single map, every single district in the states, which is why you can only see a few of them, but it identifies some really specific areas of concern for them. I'm going to push a little bit ahead, but please, at the end, feel free to ask about redistricting. It's not quite, we can spend a lot of time on it, so I'll just move ahead. The thing that we maybe do want to highlight a little bit is right now, Congress, the congressional maps have been passed by the state, but they've not yet been signed by the governor. And as you can see, they are pretty dramatically influential. There's been some significant changes across the entire state in the proposed new congressional maps, and sort of see some of those differences that are there. You can go explore these. These are on, there's Google Map links that you can get to. I can put this link in the chat for a bunch of these. I'll do that after I wrap up with this. The congressional maps are not something that we've engaged with quite a lot yet. There's a lot of things to consider with that. And we'll see and hear more as people react to the plans. But these have been passed and the governor is likely to sign these. So we will hear more about them soon. And with that, I think I'm going to actually pass it back to me to talk about some of the next stuff that's coming up.
Thank you, Cliff. Well, this next and nearly last topic could be a conversation in itself. And so for now, we're just going to stick to highlights, but there have been a number of laws enacted this year in anticipation of next year's important midterm election year that are going to mean that elections are continuing to evolve in Illinois. And there are some important changes that have been made, have already been signed into law that will impact communities of color and voters more broadly. For those of us involved with civic engagement, either in helping people register to vote or informing people about their rights, we will want to drill down on this in even more detail as we get to next year's primary. And we're happy to stay in touch as part of that conversation if we can be a helpful resource. To sum it up, here on this slide are some highlights of the changes coming for next year's election. The most important change is that the primary election has been delayed to happen in late June of next year instead of in the spring like we normally see. And this has been primarily because of the delayed census and redistricting processes that happened in 2021 that, as Cliff described, changed the lines of the districts at the various levels of government, local, state, and federal. And it means that candidates don't, in many instances, candidates and voters don't know the district lines for sure yet. And so people can't even, file their candidate paperwork until they have a better idea of, okay, these lines that were enacted according to census information, are they going to stay that way? Or are courts going to continue to change the lines that were drawn by our lawmakers? And so for all those reasons, the primary election will be later next year to allow those processes to take place. And that is a 1-year change only. This change is just for the 2022 election. In 2022, we will also see Election Day as a state holiday, which will affect the availability of some potential polling places, such as schools and government buildings in some instances. We also will see a right that people have for universal polling places in each county. We saw this during pandemic times in the 2020 elections, and then many local communities also had important municipal elections this year in 2021. And we saw this concept of universal polling places in each county, in each election jurisdiction, where it worked like early voting, if that makes sense. In early voting for many of our communities, we can go to any location in our jurisdiction, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something super close to home, but we could go to a more centralized location in our county, or for in the case of City of Chicago voters, they could go to a super site in the city. And that was typically the process for early voting, but until recently for election day, people were limited to in Illinois to going to their home precinct, their assigned precinct specifically. Now there will be universal polling places on election day, at least one such centralized place in each county. It still maybe not be a whole lot of places that are all that easy for people to get to, but it could provide some helpful options. There is some possible downside to that. I know it sounds like that's great news. What could be wrong with that? I think a possible downside is if there will be some elimination of the local neighborhood polling places as a swap. Let's have some more centralized, large, maybe more modern polling places that anyone from the county can go to, but I think it's up to voters to be vigilant that that doesn't happen at the expense of the more close proximate polling places that for some people, it's going to be more feasible and familiar for them to go vote closer to home instead of having to go, downtown or to another town over, for example. So that's something we should all keep our eye on. There are expanded rights for curbside voting availability for community members. This is especially important in pandemic times so that if people could have a variety of reasons why they don't want to or maybe even can't go into a polling place, but curbside voting would allow some greater availability of being able to get assistance and actually get access to a ballot right outside the polling place. Polling places in jails is something that has already been on a roll in Illinois. And thanks to a law passed this year in 2021, jails, in addition to Cook County Jail, but other jails as well, now have the ability to voluntarily decide that they want to have a polling place as well. Now, I think it's on us as community members to contact more local officials in these counties outside of Cook and see which officials are willing to do this now that the law permits them to institute a polling place in jail. There's been some media coverage of steps that Will County is taking in that direction. And hopefully there will be more and more examples as well of suburban and other county jails that are going to make voting more accessible for people in pretrial detention. And then last but not least, Illinois has enacted a change that would allow people to sign up to get a vote by mail ballot every election, not just on a one-time basis, to cut down on paperwork that people have to keep filling out if they are sure that they want to keep voting by mail and not vote in person. And their complications will arise in the case of people who move or have other life changes or preferences in their form of voter access that they would like. And so implementation is yet to be seen of the permanent vote by mail list. And it could very well look different from a county by county basis or in different jurisdictions. And so that would be something for all of us civically engaged folks to continue to keep an eye on as well. It could be a good thing if implemented well. And last but not least, we have a couple ideas of how you can get involved in continuing to make a positive impact on our communities for voter access. And so we can go to the next slide. And we will be, in the months ahead, recruiting volunteers. Primarily our volunteers are attorneys and policy professionals, but we do have our online volunteer form open for anyone once it gets closer to election time and we launch that website, to bring on nonpartisan volunteers for our election protection effort, where we help voters over the phone and also in person. I know I talked a lot about the hotline before, but in addition to the hotline, another important component of our nonpartisan election protection program is our poll watching that we conduct in a growing number of counties. This is not just in the city of Chicago. That's certainly an important location, but we also help with protecting voting rights at the polls in a growing number of other areas outside of Chicago as well. And we also would appreciate your serious consideration of the voting in prison bill, this chance to restore voting rights for our community members who have been unfairly disenfranchised by our state laws. This bill is called Senate Bill 828. You can learn more about it from me or Cliff or Professor Rivers, who's up in this meeting as well, and Chicago Votes and other people who have been at the forefront of this fight. The bill narrowly did not pass in the recent veto session, and we are hoping that it will pass in the near future in 2022, ideally. And we hope to stay in touch with you and hear the questions that you have this evening and also in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ami and Cliff. I'm looking into the chat and I see some comments related to the possibility to work together and have postcard size information on how to vote for people who do not have access to computers. Do you do anything of that nature in your organization? I know the League does a lot in terms of voter access to and voting rights.
That's great. That's great to hear, Cammie, that the League does that. And I think it is a good idea to have information that's accessible depending on how a particular community needs and wants that information. It's absolutely a good point that not everyone wants to digest that information online. And so as it gets closer to election time, I know that there will be materials with the 866 our vote and other language line numbers on them that we can provide from, so we're Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, but National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights sends us a bunch of gear as it gets close to every election that advertise the phone number essentially. Now, I think it's a neat idea that we hear in the chat from Magda that there could be some more information like voting rights in a nutshell and maybe some more information and not just a phone number. And so I think people should adapt to what works for them and their communities in terms of the information they want to have. We have online right now, and then we'll have updated versions in 2022 of a one-pager about the main things about voting rights to know in Illinois in 2022. And then something that's longer, that's more like a 10 or 20 pager. But the one pager could be a helpful starting point, and then people could consider if they want to use, and that's just freely available. You know, we would make available to anyone who wanted it. And maybe then they could adapt it for their own community's purposes. But, you know, call upon us as well in case there are some printed off materials that we are able to provide as well as it gets closer to election time. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ami. I'm sorry. I was just going to ask if there were any of our voter engagement directors on the program tonight who might also address this question. Melanie or Renee, are you with us?
Yeah, this is Melanie. I'm here.
I'm here.
We're both here.
Oh, good. Can you address what types of things we as the League offer that are printed for people who want to learn about voting rights?
Sure. We've got all kinds of stuff. It changes as it gets closer to the election. Right now, we've got a brochure that's out there in Spanish and English that's just basically about how you can register to vote. Closer to the election, we've passed out flyers about where you can go to vote, how you can register to vote by mail, where you can look for information on candidates who are running. they're mostly in English. We've had some that have also been in Spanish. But just like Ami was saying, closer to the election is when we really push that stuff, because that's when people really want to see it. Otherwise, it just sort of, first of all, the information changes, and secondly, people just kind of don't pay attention to it unless it's top of mind.
I want to say to this as Renee, we struggle quite a bit with postcard size information, and we have full page information, we have double-sided information, we have half-size sheet information. It's always a big decision what to leave out when you go that small.
Thank you very much to our directors of voter engagement and registration. Let's see if we have, maybe we can talk a little bit too about young voters. We have someone who said it was Magda again, who had an encounter with a high school student who was wondering how much she had to pay to register to vote.
That's so concerning, and thanks for sharing that story. One thing I wanted to share is that in the 2021 laws that were amended in Illinois, there is some greater access now that nonpartisan groups have to educate and help register community members in high school. That doesn't fix everything, but that is one step of what the legislature has allowed. Now, a farther step that advocates were interested in that didn't happen yet in Illinois, that maybe could be a part of our future election system, is pre-registration of eligible voters. So the idea that some other states have, which is that when people are 16 or 17, getting on a pre-registration list, because that could be the point in time where they're getting a driver's license, for example, or they're interacting with our government in different ways. And could there be a way to add them to a list so that when they when they become voting age, 18 for a general election, or 17 in some cases in Illinois, if they will be 18 by the time of a general election, could they automatically then get added to be an active, properly registered voter instead of, I already went to the Secretary of State's office to get my driver's license when I was 16. I don't think I'm necessarily going to go back and go through another process when I turn 17 or 18. So pre-registration is something that many nonpartisan voting rights enthusiasts would like to see, to make it a little bit easier on young people to have their information added to the rolls at the right time when they become eligible. But it's not something that Illinois lawmakers have approved of yet. I don't really know why. And I think that it's up to community members to put more pressure on them if this is a change we want to see. But as of now, there's nothing automatic like that. If someone got a driver's license when they were 16, then they have to figure out when they become old enough to vote, they have to go and on their own volition, they have to be proactive and go and get registered to vote under Illinois law right now. And then I'm going to turn it over to Cliff. I'm seeing some more questions come in, and I'm going to turn it over to Cliff to answer the question about voting in prisons, Senate Bill 828.
Thanks. So the question that is in the chat is about Senate Bill 828 and the potential conflict that it might have with the Illinois State Constitution. We don't believe that there is a conflict with the Constitution. The Constitution basically says that, well, I can just read it. A person convicted of a felony or otherwise under a sentence in a correctional institution or jail shall lose the right to vote, which right shall be restored not later than upon completion of his sentence. So the basic setup here is that the moment somebody goes into or is under sentence in a correctional institution after conviction, they lose the right to vote at that moment, but it leaves it pretty open for the General Assembly to restore the right when it chooses to do so, and that it can't do that later than the completion of the sentence. So there's a little bit more that we can talk about in terms of why that's the reading of it and why that's the justification of it. There's a fairly clear, plain language definition of not later than that we are looking quite a lot at, but there's also a fair amount of history at the Constitutional Convention that they passed this at that discussed exactly this point of leaving it open for the General Assembly to restore that right earlier than the completion of the sentence. So we've presented on this issue a number of times in sort of the various different settings and worked with different people at different levels of staff, like staff members at different levels of the government, whether that's for people that are working for representatives and legislators, or people working for various different administrative agencies, or even the governor in some cases. So we've been, and we did, this is like a really good moment for us too, in some sense, because we've been able to use some of our partner law firms to do this work as well. So we have a pro bono partner, Deckert, which is a law firm that has been really, really helping out with the research on this and being really willing to jump in and help with advocating around the constitutionality question and supporting us in that work, which has been great as well.
Okay, we have another question from Deborah. This fight for voting rights seems multi-pronged. There has been much emphasis on allowing rights for disenfranchised. Have there been efforts toward the suppression of votes as well as voter intimidation at the polls?
Great question, Deborah. And I definitely agree that protecting the rights of currently eligible voters is of paramount importance as well. And there is unfortunately voter intimidation, even in Illinois. It's not going to be as much talked about as some other states and some other areas, but unfortunately voter intimidation does happen every election in Illinois. I'm not saying it happens to the majority of voters or anything. I'm not trying to scare anyone, because many people do have a smooth voting experience, thankfully. But we still think that even if it's a few people, that's wrong. You know, we should try to address that, especially because it can affect different communities differently. And chronically, voter intimidation does affect Black voters and voters of color. Now, what we've noticed through our nonpartisan voter protection work is that voter intimidation is especially apparent in Illinois and Chicago in municipal elections, in elections where it's really close in terms of who might win or lose an election. And that's not always going to be, you know, a presidential general election in the state of Illinois. Sometimes the closest contests are for a school board position or for a city council member or a town mayor, you know, some of those. And the intimidation can even happen within a party, like in a primary election where it's closely contested and maybe candidates of the same party running against each other, and candidates or campaigns really trying to do everything they can to get any one last vote, and then resorting to tactics that we as voting rights advocates think go too far. You know, we're here for the voter. We're not here to take a side with one candidate or another. So sometimes our opinions of what candidates do, you know, they may land on it differently. They may think, oh, I was just trying to, you know, make my case to a voter, but we think it can sometimes go too far in what a campaign tries to do to get every last vote. So those instances of voter intimidation also can be very personal. You know, it can be something that's a bit hard to document or prove because it might just happen so quick, as far as something, an unfair or uncomfortable situation that a voter could be put in. When I was outside a polling place in Chicago a few years ago, it was in the 2016 election, a situation happened to me, and I'm sure the person who made the comment didn't know I'm a voting rights attorney and didn't know, you know, why I was at the polling place. But I was there trying to help with the voter access issue, and someone walked by me and told me to go back to where I came from. And it took me a minute to even realize what was going on, or that it was directed at me. And then it kind of sunk in, and bothered me, even though I was not actually voting at the time. And I felt like I have a lot of privilege in that situation. And I was going to be all right, you know, even though the person was trying to get to me. But a lot of people in that situation wouldn't be so fortunate. And that may affect their decision of whether they want to stick around or not. And that's really unfortunate. And so we're going to continue to stand up for voters and try to help talk them through situations like that may come up, and advocate to election officials and try to create a safe environment for voters whenever that's needed.
We have a question from Gail, who asked if there's been an impact of the US Postal Service reliability on the vote by mail.
Yes, and it was so, as a lot of you probably saw, it was so extreme last year. I think so many people have lost their faith in the Postal Service, as far as, you know, some of those timely things like getting a ballot in, that it's just affected people's habits so much. And drop boxes have become all the more important so that people have a non-mail way of getting a ballot in. And we're fortunate that in many parts of Illinois, drop boxes are utilized and really increased a whole lot in the year 2020, and hopefully will be here to stay. So that it doesn't take mail totally out of the equation, because if someone signs up to vote by mail, they would presumably still get their ballot mailed to them, but then at least it makes the mailing back part possibly a little easier if someone has a drop-off option. One thing I wanted to mention, just as a comparison, is that in Indiana, the vote by mail system is so restrictive that there are very, very few excuses someone can give to even get their hands on a vote by mail ballot, but most people are not allowed to vote by mail. And then even if they are in the few categories of people who can vote by mail, in Indiana, their mail ballot, their completed signed vote by mail ballot, has to be received by the election authority by noon on election day for it to be counted. Otherwise, it is not counted. And in Illinois, there's a more fair policy that has to be postmarked by that day. And then even if it takes some longer time to get in, up to 2 weeks later, it still is to be counted under Illinois law. So I think there are yes, there are delays, Gail, as you pointed out, because of the Postal Service issues, but there are some safeguards built into the Illinois system as well, thankfully.
Our last question will be if people on parole are eligible to vote.
Yes, people on probation and parole are eligible to vote in Illinois. And you've heard us talk about how we think that the law should be expanded even farther, but even under the current law, people on parole and probation are eligible to vote. They would presumably have to re-register though, because they would have been taken off of the rolls when they were serving a sentence in conjunction with a conviction, but then they are eligible to get back on the rolls once the parole or probation starts.
Okay, I think it's just about time for us to wrap up. I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but I do want to express our sincere thanks to Ami and Cliff for this excellent presentation tonight. I'm so proud that we were able to bring you to speak to the public on this important issue that we have in terms of voting rights.
Camille, may I have a question?
Oh, sure.
I'm sorry, I'm known as the big mouth. Amy, so as you were saying, people who are on parole and on, I forgot the other word what you used, I'm sorry, who are out of jail and they didn't serve all their term, they are eligible to vote, but they have to re-register. Well, exactly as people who are going to motor voter to get their driver license renewed back and register to vote. Would it be possible for the justice system, for the jailers, or whatever the organization who allows Joe Schmo to leave the prison, to also offer the re-registration?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's an area that Illinois could get stronger in, to have some kind of more streamlined procedure to allow people to register to vote, to get an ID and register to vote as soon as they're eligible. And it requires a lot of extra steps right now. So it seems like some of these processes are undergoing improvement in Illinois, but we're not there yet, because we still hear stories from people who are just facing one barrier after another trying to get the simple paperwork done. So thank you for your idea. I agree. I'll turn it back to Cami to wrap it up.
Okay, and I am Cami Bassick. I'm co-director of programs for the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area with my partner, Gail Benakis. But again, thank you very much, Ami and Cliff, for this presentation. I want to thank our audience for taking the time out of your evening to be with us tonight and learn more how we can protect our democracy. And finally, I want to thank our great partners, Delta Sigma Theta, for joining us on this exploration of voting rights. Well, I think we'll close it up tonight. And again, thank you everyone for being with us. Patty, do you want to stop recording?